Welcome to this installment of Zarathustra Summer, where I go through sections of Thus Spoke Zarathustra and try and interpret it and see what Zarathustra is trying to teach us, in particular related to the Ubermensch project and his attempt to overcome the nihilism of the last man. So this section stood out to me because it's titled The Prophet, but it's really a doomer would be the kind of like contemporary way of referring to this guy. He's a doomer. Zarathustra comes across someone who's called the prophet. The prophet gives this short little monologue, a little speech, and then what happens is Zarathustra falls into a kind of depressive state of kind of shock or grief for a few days, and then one of his disciples sort of shakes him out of this and wakes him up. So we'll go through it in detail and look at the rhetoric that's been used, and kind of look in more detail into what it was that kind of shocked Zarathustra out of his purpose and his stride, and what brought him back and so forth. So maybe the first thing to go over is the doomer's little speech. So I'll read some of it. I won't read all of it, but I'll read a little bit of it. So the prophet, or the doomer, says, "I saw a great sadness come over mankind. The best grew weary of their works. A teaching went forth, a belief ran beside it. Everything is empty, everything is one, everything is past. And from every hill it resounded, everything is empty, everything is one, everything is past. We have harvested, it is true, but why did all of our fruits turn rotten and brown? What fell from the wicked moon last night? All our work has been in vain, all our wine has become poison." I'm skipping ahead a bit here. "Truly we have grown too weary even to die. We are still awake, and we live on in sepulchres." And the sepulchres are like kind of old word for what you might put ashes or a tomb, a dead body inside, like a kind of like a tomb, a place of worship for the dead. But it's not just a grave. It's something which is kind of like a small building. It kind of encloses the ashes, or encloses the body inside of. So the interesting thing about this little passage from the doomer, or the prophet, is that he is using a lot of Zarathustra's own sort of rhetoric and logic. He's talking about the best have grown weary of their works. We have harvested, but our fruits have turned rotten. Our own wine has poisoned us. So you have this sort of last man theme, which is very common in a lot of Nietzsche's work, but especially Zarathustra, where you have the last man is a sort of a person who's inherited something potentially great, but there's something missing. There's some struggle, purpose, meaning, so something which no longer defines great men becomes absent, but you're left with the products, the fruits of what perhaps great men have done. And this would be similar to another passage where Zarathustra says, we make ourselves poor through our riches, and so on. This kind of decadence, this degeneracy, comes about not through an absence, but through like almost an excess or an over presence of prosperity, wealth, comfort, security, and so forth. So, interestingly, in this paragraph, it is this kind of prophet who is using a lot of Zarathustra's own rhetoric, and very interestingly, at the end, he says, "We have grown too weary, even to die," which would bring up a theme of kind of zombie-like existence, a kind of an excessive existence which has no purpose. We are still awake and we live on in sepulchres. So we live in sepulchres. We live in a kind of tomb, right? We live in merely something, and I think the temporal element here is important. We merely live inside something which is there to kind of acknowledge the past, right? This is what graves and tombs are. And I mean, they're important. This is an important thing to do. But the whole point of life has become to worship the past, right? And this would be fitting into some of Nietzsche's critique of, if you think of his essay, The Use and Abuse of History, this kind of past worship, which is maybe a bit different to conservatism and traditionalism and all this stuff. You could easily be progressive and secular and have a past worship because you think, wow, look at all these great things that were achieved and done and left behind and built. And I think a lot of, for example, a lot of tourism kind of, you go to ancient Egypt and you look at the pyramid and you go, wow, look at that, look what these people did. This is like, we are just these observers. Our whole life has been reduced to observing what's already been done. And that would also fit the rhetoric here of everything is empty, everything is one, everything is past, everything is in the past. Like there's no future. We're in this tomb. We're trapped of just looking at history, looking at the past, with no real involvement. So Zarathustra is pretty taken back by this prophet, and it says, "Thus did Zarathustra hear a prophet speak, and his prophecy went to Zarathustra's heart and transformed him. He went about sad and weary, and he became like one of those whom the prophet had spoken. Truly, he said to his disciples, this long twilight is very nearly upon us. Alas, how shall I preserve my light through it? May it not be smothered in this sadness. It is meant to be a light to more distant worlds and to the most distant nights. Zarathustra went about grieving thus in his heart, and for 3 days he took no food or drink, had no rest, and forgot speech." There's this, there's a sort of eschatological elements to The Last Man, if you think about it. He marks this end time of human purpose, and I suppose Zarathustra's reaction is somewhat a real fear of this moment and a real sort of fundamental understanding of the catastrophe of the last man, of this moment. And he kind of withdraws and goes into this state of shock, this state of grief, with the attempt to preserve the light. The light probably being, hope for something beyond the last man, because of course the Übermensch is the thing beyond the last man. But I also think there's another way you can read this, in that because the doomer and the prophet, his rhetoric is very Zarathustrian, right? Like it's almost as if the first time I read this, I had to read it back and go, wait, who wrote this part? Oh, it's the prophet who said this, not Zarathustra, because this is exactly something Zarathustra would say. And I think this is because maybe Zarathustra, this is about halfway through the book now, and I think Zarathustra is seeing the influence he's had on other people. So I don't know if you spend a lot of time online or something, or perhaps if you're, you can see people having an effect of other people maybe with large followings on social media who write a lot of books. They're in the public a lot. Like, for example, Zizek is a good example. You can really see the effect, the influence Zizek has had on people. You can really see, like, Zizekian thinking, you can see it reflected back. And it must be weird for these people that have this much influence to actually confront their own influence coming back at them. and the doomer is perhaps in some ways like the sort of brutal black pilling part of Zarathustra's critique, but he sees it in this person who's almost accepted it. He's critiquing, he's being critical in a very Zarathustrian way, but he's saying it in a way as if to say, well, this is the way it is, and this is inevitable. This is the inevitable trajectory of the world. It's very doomy. It's very black pilly, but there's no sense of subversion. There's no sense of a way out or an overcoming, and these other elements to Zarathustra, which are very important. So I think this is like, okay, well, like, perhaps Zarathustra is fearing that he's influenced the world in a bad sense because he hasn't emphasized the overcoming aspect enough. He's been too doomy and gloomy, and this in and of itself is perhaps even worse than not having anything at all, or any influence from Zarathustra at all. So Zarathustra goes into this almost a kind of comatose state for a few days, and then he wakes up and he has had a dream while he was in his kind of withdrawal, and he's going to now tell everybody about the dream. I dreamt I had renounced all life. I had become a night watchman, a grave watchman, yonder upon the lonely hill fortress of death. Up there I guarded death's coffins. The musty vaults stood full of these symbols of death's victory. Life overcome regarded me from glass coffins. I breathed the odor of dust-covered eternities. My soul lay sultry and dust-covered. And who could have ventilated his soul there? I'm not going to read the whole thing out, or I'm going to skip ahead, but basically he continues to describe being trapped in this weird place, and it's very doomy, and it's very isolating, and it's very suffocating, and it's probably a sepulcher. It's a tomb. It's some sort of tomb. Anyway, and I'm going to skip a little bit ahead to the end. He says, and I turned the key. This is the key to a door, which he's trying to leave the tomb with. And I turned the key and tugged at the door and exerted myself, but it did not open by so much a finger's breadth. Then a raging wind tore the door asunder, whistling, shrilling, and piercing it through to me a black coffin. And in the roaring and whistling and shrilling, the coffin burst asunder and vomited forth 1,000 peals of laughter. And from 1,000 masks of children, angels, owls, fools, and child-sized butterflies, it laughed and mocked and roared at me. This terrified me dreadfully. It prostrated me, and I shrieked with horror, and as I had never shrieked before. But my own shrieking awoke me, and I came to myself. And after Zarathustra explains his dream, one of his kind of primary disciples interprets the dream. So he says, your life itself interprets to us this dream, Zarathustra. Are you yourself not the wind with a shrill whistling that tears open the doors of the fortress of death? Are you yourself not the coffin full of motley wickedness and angel masks of life? Truly Zarathustra comes into all sepulchres like 1,000 peals of children's laughter, laughing at these night watchmen and grave watchmen, and whoever else rattles gloomy keys. You have shown us new stars and new glories of the night. Truly, you have spread out laughter itself above, like a motley canopy. Henceforth, laughter of children will always issue from coffins. Henceforth, a strong wind will always come, victorious to all weariness unto death. Of that you yourself are our guarantee and prophet. This interpretation of Zarathustra's dream then wakes up Zarathustra out of his depression, out of his grief, and draws him back into the continuing on his way. And I think it's interesting to see this dream of Zarathustra, this wind, this intrusive thing which blows open the coffin, blows open the all this very gloomy and very dour and dark environment, this sepulcher, this tomb, what sort of intrudes into it and bursts it open is interpreted by his disciple as Zarathustra himself. So, on one hand, you begin with, I suppose, you have two elements of Zarathustra's influence here at work. You've got the first one, which is his kind of like blackpilling and his kind of warning about the catastrophe of the death of God and of the victory of nihilism and so forth, and that's represented in the doomer. But if you just have the doomer, you're going to go into a depressive state, and all this is no longer a warning which you can respond to. It becomes a pure inevitability. So the disciple, kind of loyal disciple, then becomes someone who says no. He kind of represents the overcoming, the Ubermensch side, the heroic spirit, who's going to be able to kind of intrude and burst through this kind of fatalistic tomb, which Zarathustra ultimately becomes trapped in. The lesson you could draw from this is something like, if you're gonna have doom pilling, you're gonna need overcoming. You're gonna need that heroic spirit, because if you have doom pilling without that heroic spirit, without that wind that's gonna burst down the door of the tomb, you're gonna trap yourself inside it, and you're gonna turn something which is a negative trajectory into an inevitability, because this doomer is also a prophet, so he's there to tell, and he's there to announce a predetermined fate. And I suppose what Zarathustra is trying to deal with is, how do we take what you're saying seriously without agreeing with you insofar as your role as a prophet? Like, what you're saying is true, but you are not a prophet. Like, what you're saying is true, but this is not the end, and this is not the inevitable trajectory. This is only the unfortunate current trajectory of things, is not the inevitable one. So when people speak the truth from a kind of blackpilling position, let's say, you have to ask yourself, it's true insofar as the content of what they're saying might be quite true. But who is speaking of it? Are you speaking of this from the position of a prophet? Because if you're speaking of it from the position of a prophet, then you're not speaking the truth. Then you're affirming the problem. You're not speaking the truth.